Hello, and welcome to the Knowing Iron podcast season 2. I'm your host, Lily Busby, and my first guest of the season is Dr. Kellie Turtle, who has recently completed her PhD in social policy. In this episode, we will be talking about the role of religion in policy making. So, Kellie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, thanks very much for having me, Lily. I'm a researcher at Ulster University. I'm particularly interested in how religion influences decision making here in Northern Ireland. And I suppose the reason I got into that research is based on my own background. I'm someone who grew up in a very religious environment. Through my teenage years in particular, was like a very passionate evangelical Christian. And as I got older, I started to become exposed to, I suppose, other ways of looking at the world and became interested in things like social justice, feminism, rights for LGBT people, and had trouble negotiating all of that with my own personal faith beliefs. And for me, I couldn't really find any way to explore that, so I just left the church. I've been really involved in feminist activism for about 10 to 15 years now. And then more recently, whenever I started to look at the issue of abortion, I realised I wanted to bring those two parts of myself back together. Um, and I think that sums up what a lot of people are experiencing in Northern Ireland, because there's a lot of Christianity all around, whether it's people who've grown up in that or people who've been exposed to it, just because it's in our institutions, our schools, our political system. And so we're always trying to kind of negotiate religion and negotiate Christianity in particular. So, yeah, that's a bit of my background and my personal reasons for being involved in this. But I'm a feminist activist still, and actually doing this research has brought me back to my faith in a lot of ways, although it's a very different version of it than the one I had when I was younger.
And what did you find in this research?
So I set out to try and listen to the stories of people of faith who would have more liberal views on abortion than the dominant, official religious position in Northern Ireland. So I interviewed 22 people. 6 of those people had either had an abortion or considered abortion. 5 of them had had an abortion and 1 had considered it but chose to continue the pregnancy in the end. So what I was trying to find out was, how did they talk about abortion? Did they use different language than the kind of what you might hear, say, for example, from a conservative minister or priest who you might hear on the radio arguing against abortion? I wanted to know how these more liberal Christians would talk about it. I also, I should say, I interviewed a Muslim participant and a Jewish participant to get a broader view, because religion's not just Christianity, although it's often boiled down to that in this country. So I discovered that people have very compassionate views when it comes to abortion. There's 2 main ways that I find these more liberal faith voices talked about it. The first is they had a different way of understanding, I suppose, the ethical question around termination of pregnancy and the value of the life of the fetus. Now, I would say some of them really still believe that life begins at conception and held that belief, although they'd come to a different position on abortion. But most of my participants felt that a very absolute idea that life begins at conception just wasn't really ringing true for them. It didn't make sense in the practical ways that they experienced maybe their own reproductive lives, pregnancy loss. They also just felt that it would be not a sensible moral balance for them to hold the life of a fetus in equal value to the life of a woman or a pregnant person. So they had a more nuanced view of what that meant. And but the big difference, the main focus, I would say, of what the people told me would have been how they were extremely concerned with the ethical implications or the moral implications of denying women and pregnant people access to abortion. They had a much more heightened awareness of the severe impact on that than you might hear from the mainstream religious voices. The idea that someone should be forced through the law to carry a pregnancy to term, to go through childbirth, to be forced into a situation where they're bringing a child into the world that they're not capable of supporting. My participants felt the moral weight of that very strongly, and they felt that their faith had something to say about that. They didn't want faith to be used to justify that harm. So it was really interesting. They were very compassionate, as I said. They were very aware of how unequal the world is and how the world's not black and white. And they felt that sometimes the church tries to paint this black and white issue of morality that, if you just follow the rules, everything will work out. And, these were people who were saying, we understand that life is not like that. And just they would have felt very strongly that people should be afforded the opportunity to make moral decisions about their own bodies and their own lives, and that they felt that God's requirement of them as people of faith would be to love others and to support them, to hold them up through whatever decision they ended up making.
And how did they come up with those conversations? Did they talk with their church, or did they do anything else?
That's a really interesting part of it. And a colleague of mine, Fiona Bloomer, also at Ulster University, has done previous research on this where she surveyed people. And one of the survey questions she asked them was, do you feel comfortable talking with other people in your faith community about abortion? And do you feel comfortable talking with your faith leader? And the majority of the participants in those surveys said no. Now, some of my interviewees did have safe spaces where they could talk about this, but most of them did not. I was maybe the first person they'd ever been honest with about how they actually felt about abortion. And that tells me there's still a lot of stigma and silence in faith communities here. I even interviewed 3 ministers or pastors, and they particularly felt nervous about speaking out because there would be such a backlash. And one of them was a pastor of a church who said that his church had already been picketed by anti-abortion protesters just for having a conversation about abortion that entertained kind of both sides. So I think we can see that there's definitely a culture of stigma and shame and silence that, even though the law has changed in Northern Ireland, it's probably going to take years before that's dealt with. And there's research from around the world on abortion stigma that shows that women who identify as being highly religious, they score the highest on all measures of stigma. So that makes me think, here in Northern Ireland, we have a situation where there's women sitting in churches every Sunday who've had abortions, who feel that they can't tell anyone, and that they're hearing negative messages about abortion, and that's causing a lot of distress and stigma for them.
You said that abortion services deserve more consideration by the church. What do the churches need to do?
I asked my participants what would they like to see the church doing, and could they imagine a world where the church played a more supportive role. And I think the first thing that needs to happen is that churches here need to recognise when to step away, because we have had a situation in recent years where the mainstream churches have become more vocal in their opposition to abortion. So the Presbyterian Church, even to some extent the Church of Ireland, and obviously the Catholic bishops would put out public statements, opposing changes to abortion law, opposing the new services, talking about them as if they've been imposed on Northern Ireland by this kind of secular state over in England. So I think, first of all, the churches need to step back, and they would need to recognise that we have abortion services in Northern Ireland now because people here campaigned and lobbied for them, because the United Nations came here and spoke to us all. I gave an interview to the United Nations because I've had an abortion myself. Plenty of other people talked to them, and they went away and said, yeah, something needs to change. So, it hasn't been imposed from elsewhere. And many of us who've been through this experience have faith ourselves. So I think the churches need to listen and really understand that by constantly putting out these opposing messages, they're just making the situation worse for people. They're increasing the stigma. It's a little bit like, if you haven't got anything nice to say, maybe start with not saying anything, just listen to the people who are affected. But more proactively than that, I think churches need to be a safe space, a genuinely safe space where people can go and talk about their reproductive experiences. Church should be somewhere we can bring all of our lives, all the messy bits and everything. I mean, I when I was in my 30s, had 5 years of, reproductive experiences where I had two babies, I had two miscarriages, and I had an abortion. And church was not somewhere where I could have talked about any of that, to be honest. So I'd like to see churches take that on. And I think there would need to be a bit more women-led, to be honest, in order to make that a reality.
And no, because all the loud voices sort of tar the whole Christians as, anti-abortion, whereas that's not the case.
We haven't had much room to explore that here in Northern Ireland, because when it comes to our religious culture, obviously because of the conflict, it can be quite tense. You've got very kind of dominant voices within the Catholic tradition, the Protestant tradition, and then you've got very excluded religious minorities who rarely get asked their opinion on social issues at all. So it's difficult. It's a difficult environment. But if you look to somewhere like America, there's decades and decades of a legacy of faith communities being very much involved in trying to improve access to abortion, improve women's reproductive health care. In fact, back in the 1960s, whenever abortion hadn't been legalized in America yet, that it was very dangerous to have an abortion at that time. There were underground kind of illegal providers, and women were losing their lives in quite large numbers. And the churches were at the forefront of the campaign to change that, because as pastors, those church leaders felt like they couldn't sit back and watch women be injured and be killed because they were so desperate to access abortion. In fact, one of the very first legal abortion clinics in the whole of the United States was opened by a Baptist church in New York. So if you think about where things are now in the religious debate about abortion, things have obviously changed in America as well, but there's still that strong legacy and strong history of having a whole range of views on abortion. I think the fact that there's no clear agreement about things like the moral status of a fetus, when is the beginning of life, these things are philosophical questions that are always up for debate and always have been, right back to the church fathers and forefathers and foremothers. So I would like Northern Ireland to expand a little bit in the religious conversation more generally, and take in different views and different approaches to what faith means when we look at these social issues.
And do you think all this like moral and faith concerns, have they been dragged into the political arena, and what implications would this have?
Yeah, I think this is the biggest issue that we face at the minute, where we try and build a more progressive, more compassionate, more tolerant Northern Ireland. Religion has been weaponized in the political sphere. And it's not just here that's happening. Obviously, as I mentioned, that's happening in America as well. But I would like to present alternative voices, just to try and challenge the dominance of those very conservative views from the inside, because you can sometimes end up with this secular versus religious debate, and you feel like those two sort of cultures don't really understand each other. And I get frustrated because I come from within, particularly that Protestant evangelical culture that would shape the likes of the DUP. I come from within that tradition, and yet I feel they don't represent me. So I want to be part of presenting alternatives. So yeah, I think it's really time for those of us who don't feel represented by that to stand up and say, you know what, I'm a Christian, and what you're saying Christianity looks like is unrecognizable to me. And it falls down on all of these values that I think are central to my faith. And just be able to, as I said, present an alternative. All you need to do is stand up and say, hi, I think differently, because the political power only is held whenever they can claim to speak for everyone. And that's just simply not the case.
And how important is research like the research you've done to society?
I think research is so important to this conversation because it has to be evidence-based. It's all very well for me in my campaigner days coming along and saying what I thought, but to be able to actually go out and speak to people, gather the views of a wider demographic, challenge those norms and assumptions that exist out there, that's really, really important. And I was challenged myself in some of the things that I heard from my participants. So you don't go in as a researcher with a particular point that you want to make and then try and speak to people who'll help you make your point. You go in to genuinely learn and listen and have your own views challenged as well. So for example, a lot of my participants did express much more emotional, I suppose, complexity about abortion than I would personally have. As I said, I've had an abortion myself and it was quite a straightforward experience for me. I didn't have a whole lot of emotional baggage about it. I wasn't particularly conflicted spiritually or anything. And it was a relief just given my circumstances at the time. But I spoke to a lot of people through my study who had a very difficult experience. And they've worked through why that might have been and all the different contexts that they found themselves in that led to that. And they all would have said at the end of it, they still totally believe in the right to make that choice, but they would like to see more acknowledgement that it's not always an easy choice and it's not one that comes, free from baggage and distress and emotions that you need space to work through. So I think that's a really important challenge to the more secular pro-choice community as well. It's how we make space for that. Research is vital.
And what would you say to those women who do feel alienated within the church community?
I think we need to find each other and we need to really work together and support each other because it's a very difficult and lonely place to be. And it can also come with the baggage of quite a lot of abusive dynamics. There's not been much work done on it here in this country, but in America in the last sort of 10 years, there's been a lot of research on how women are treated within very conservative religious communities, the sort of spiritual abuse, but the full spectrum, to be honest, right through to sort of sexual abuse, where women are simultaneously being taught that they have to submit to men in authority. Well, that's still a very popular viewpoint in some of our more fundamentalist churches here. So your own feelings and thoughts and desires as a woman should be submitted to the authority of the men around you. And also they're being taught that their sexuality is a very dangerous thing. And so when there is abusive dynamics going on within churches, women are often made to feel like they're to blame for everything. And they don't trust their own instincts. They just trust whatever the men, in authority are telling them. And when women come out of that, it can be really difficult. It can be like coming out of an abusive relationship. So I think a lot of women need loads of support just to even recognise the dynamics that are going on and then to heal from that when they do decide to come out. We've got some brilliant therapists in this country as well who work specifically in the area of spiritual abuse and just walk with people along that journey of finding your own self again, finding your own voice and your confidence in who you are as a person. We need to find each other. We need to work together and just be that community that we often don't have. There's loads of women in churches. Churches are kept going by women, but it's incredible just how subtly they're kept sort of in their place and not in a position where they feel they can actually change things.
Is there anything else you would like to add?
I think the main thing is to add is just that I also have a real passion for ensuring that those minority religious voices get more prominence, because I know I've talked a lot today about Christianity. It's Christianity that seems to be driving a lot of the political agenda, but I think we have so much to gain by ensuring that people from other faiths are respected and we can have a more genuinely pluralistic society here. Certainly when you talk about abortion, there's much more nuanced theology and doctrine in the Jewish tradition, in the Muslim tradition. There's fantastic spiritual practices in the Buddhist tradition that help people resolve some of those emotional remainders after having an abortion. So if we could have more kind of cross-pollination and listening to each other from across different faiths, I think that would really enrich how we approach social issues. And certainly people of all faiths should be consulted more fully when it comes to policy and how things affect them as well.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. Stay tuned and we'll talk later.